So you'd want is a cap, really? Do you think there's a wealth cap? Because that's a very radical idea.
It's a very radical idea. I think I would like to see a very high tax rate, like 90% or something like that.
After which point?
Probably in terms of wealth, I would say $1 billion.
Welcome to Thinkers on Times Radio. You know the format by now. We try and have a slightly longer conversation with people with big ideas, big intellects, to try and understand a bit more about the world around us. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Dr Cahal Moran. He's got a great book. He's got a lot of great ideas. Why We're Getting Poorer is probably on people's minds, Carl. It's a great title.
Oh, thank you.
It's a bit clickbaity, but I know why you've done it, and I admire that, because it actually is genuinely, it's not too clickbaity. It actually gets to the heart of what you're trying to talk about. But it's a pressing issue. Why does economics not work for us? How does economics work? How do our countries seem to be constantly getting poorer? Why we've not recovered from the financial crash of 2008? All sorts of big questions. So let's try and get into some of them. Do you have an overarching theory here? Do you have an overarching belief that you want to try and tell us about?
Well, yeah, I think that there are maybe two theories, if I'm allowed that. So there are two ways that the economy is structured that I think really haven't been working for the average person since the financial crisis, maybe before, maybe since the 1980s, or maybe for even longer. One of them is that the economy is uneven. So that is basically inequality. There are billionaires who seem to dominate industry, the media, politics. But on the other end of that, you have these left behind communities, people living in poverty, people living in slums, people really struggling, right? So essentially, we've structured our economy in a way that seems to favour the people at the top, and we've left the people at the bottom behind. So that's what part one of the book is about. Part two of the book is about how the economy is dysfunctional. And what that is it's more just that some things don't work very well. And that seems to affect rich and poor alike. So, for instance, the housing market is one that just doesn't seem to work at all. We're in London. London's a fantastic city. London's a lot better off than the rest of the UK in many ways. But house prices are still absolutely absurd. We still spend so much of our money on rent and mortgages here. So the housing market isn't working for a lot of people. The money system isn't working for a lot of people. And there are just areas of our economy that I think we haven't really put much thought into how we structure them.
We'll get into some of those details as we go along. But is it fair to say then that we talk about late capitalism, capitalism failing? The system that, capitalism is one of the great success stories of the world. And if you look at, I suppose, poverty 150 years ago, life expectancy 150 years ago, equality 150 years ago, you could argue that the growth of capitalism has coincided and fueled a growth in a great number of advances. But yes, in this late stage of the game, has it failed? Can we go that far, do you think?
I think capitalism is this extremely powerful engine that was unleashed a few hundred years ago in England, right? And it has relentlessly increased material standards of living. And it's also been associated with a bunch of democratic and liberal advances as well. And I think all of those are great things. But right now, I think we really do need to ask fundamental questions about whether it's working, because what we're seeing is, look, the rise of billionaires. We're seeing that they're taking control of the government, and that there are lots of steps backwards in terms of government policy that are having really negative impacts on people. And I think if billionaires taking over government isn't a failure of capitalism, then I don't know what is.
But hasn't that always been a feature of capitalism? If you think of sort of Gilded Age America, where very, very few people controlled very, very many parts of the industry. There were some super rich people in America in the end of the 19th century. They influenced government, they controlled the party machine in America. That was 130 years ago. So is it an inherent, it's not a bug, it's a feature of capitalism that there will always be some very, very rich people and they'll always be really, really powerful?
I think that it is a feature of capitalism, which isn't to say that you can't address it within capitalism, right? So what happened after the Gilded Age? We didn't overthrow capitalism in the West. We didn't have socialism. What we had was like trust busting and eventually sort of very high tax rates and things like that.
Trade unions, I suppose.
Trade unions too, exactly, and the welfare state, right? All of these things that do the opposite of what I'm outlining in the book. They benefit the average person and the poor, and they, limit the power and the wealth of the better off. So you can take steps within capitalism. I think for me, the question, and I go back and forth on this, I don't really know. The question is whether we can reliably achieve that tamed form of capitalism, or whether it will always kind of break out,
And the question is, in the 80s, it was a very trendy phrase, trickle-down economics, and the idea that ultimately, as the rich got richer, everyone got richer. And because the rich were job creators, they were wealth creators, therefore a successful one meant a success for all. Do you fundamentally not buy that argument, the argument of trickle-down economics?
No, not at all. I don't think that the rich sort of spending lots of money on luxury yachts and things like that benefits everyone. Clearly it creates employment, but then money spent anywhere creates employment. If you redistribute the wealth, that will also create employment, and it will create wealth in industries that benefit everyone, not just things like luxury yachts. And I don't think, I think economists have looked at this, whether these tax cuts on the very rich and whether these tax cuts on corporations actually result in things like higher growth, and they just find that it generally doesn't.
What about the argument that, at least in this country, that the richest, I'm not talking about billionaires here, I'm talking about probably asset millionaires, people who are wealthy, they shoulder quite a high burden of the tax in terms of what they actually do pay. And they are, therefore, I suppose wealth does do good, because even though there is great inequality, which I want to get to, asset inequality, particularly in this country, if you look at the amount of tax generated by a comparative few, you could make the case that the rich, not the super rich, the rich pay their fair share, pay more than their fair share, pay a good amount, a chunk of money to the betterment of society.
Well, I think that there are two things there, really. One is the reason the rich pay so much taxes because there's so much income flowing to them, right? So if you had what Ed Miliband called pre-distribution, where you've actually got more money flowing to the working class and middle classes, then they would be paying more tax, right? And so I think that's a bit of a problem with the income distribution in the first place. But there's also this question of, look, is there just some level of income that we think is too high, right?
Yeah.
Even if it generates tax revenue, is it harmful? Is it socially harmful? If you think about something like buying up a lot of the real estate in central London so that, it's not really accessible for people. If you think about things like the corruption of politics and lobbying, right? Then I think that we have to ask whether we just want to use taxes to limit income and limit wealth, as well as to raise revenue.
So you'd want to, is it a cap, really? Do you think there's a wealth cap? Because that's a very radical idea.
It's a very radical idea. I think I would like to see a very high tax rate, like 90% or something like that.
Beyond, after which point?
After
million,
which point? Or
50 million, 100 million?
I think probably, in terms of wealth, I would say $1 billion. In terms of wealth,
assets here, aren't we?
Right. Yeah.
Because
yes.
I think we should make this distinction, because I'm sure people will think about it, but there's a difference between earned income,
yes,
and asset wealth. And arguably, asset wealth is where we're even more unequal as a society than we are in income, because ultimately, a lot of people have bought houses, the property market's gone up, land has got more valuable, so there's an awful lot of assets owned by people that are worth quite a lot of money. And as you say, billionaires come in, they've been buying farmland to avoid inheritance tax. They buy properties in central London, which appreciate in value. So would you argue for a high income tax and a wealth tax, or both, or just the wealth tax?
Yeah, it's important, because I think that these are two different things, right? And it's easy to kind of talk about both of them simultaneously. I do think that wealth inequality is much more of a problem. If you think about wealth, it's something that is much more likely to be inherited. It's something that is much more likely to grant people power, the ability to buy up real estate as well as businesses and things like that. And so I do think that we shouldn't really be allowing that kind of wealth. Now, a cap, I think, just as a policy, I don't like a cap, right? I think it's kind of unworkable. There are ways around it. I think that what you're talking about is essentially quite a lot of policies, including things like antitrust, which I mentioned earlier, breaking up corporations, including a very high marginal tax rate, including regulating people properly, you know, and regulating things like financial fraud, which we actually don't really do very well, right? So all of these things, and I think what those amount to is that wealth inequality will be much lower. But I'm not talking about some kind of absolute cap. And to answer your question, I do also advocate a much higher marginal tax rate. I mean, they were much higher in the post-World War.
Well, tell people that, 'cause not everyone realises that at various parts of American history, America, the great land of wealth creation, at various points in America's history, they've been very, very high upper tax rates.
There was that 70 to 90%, and I think
is that FDR? Is that FDR?
It was. I'm not actually sure who implemented it, but it was after World War II. It was at that rate. I think it was after FDR.
So it's probably
I think it was
Eisenhower.
It was post World War II that they actually started to do that because of the sense of social solidarity that I think emerged after World War II, and we have to look out for everyone. So I'm a big advocate of a much higher marginal tax rate on income as well.
Just so I won't hold you to it, but it's what level above what? Because it's interesting that you're saying 75% above.
I think 70% above like $1 million would be
earned income a year.
Yeah. That would be something that, and I think it's funny because economists have looked at this and they look at like how much that benefits the rich versus how much it benefits the poor, and it's quite intuitive to say that if I'm destitute in poverty, then a pound is worth more to me than it is worth to a millionaire. But even if you're earning 20 grand, 30 grand, 40 grand, it's worth more to you, right? And so these welfare benefits are very high when you increase taxes on the rich. And so I think that there's quite a lot of evidence that this is something that's worth pursuing. And crucially, I think one of the things people worry about with this, right, is, and you were getting at this, you're saying they're wealth creators and they'll either leave or
they'll go to America where Donald Trump will welcome them in open arms.
Yes, exactly. But it just seems like that doesn't happen quite as much as you would think. And I think people generally, they're maybe a bit less mobile than we think, actually. People do tend to stay put. And people, there's lots of effects from increasing taxes on people. You can make people work harder by increasing taxes on them. So,
and what transformative effect would it have on the economy in your view then? So say we lived in a country where you were made Chancellor, you had ultimate powers, you don't have to worry about backbenchers or anything like that, and you effectively went after the super rich in terms of wealth. You imposed high marginal tax rate on the rich, the millionaires.
Yeah.
What are you looking at? What difference would that make? The question I'm interested in is how would someone on 30, 40 grand feel that? What would it actually mean?
So here's the thing. We're talking about wealth creation, and who drives the economy. I think that we know who is the most important to us because during the pandemic, we very quickly recognized it. It was the essential workers. And it was quite incredible, actually, because it only took a day, maybe less, for people to know exactly who the essential workers were, who would have to keep working for us to survive, for us to get by. Of course, it's not the hedge fund managers and the marketers and the YouTubers. It's the bus drivers, right? It's the farmers. It's the people who deliver and distribute goods, right? So those are the most important people. And I think, especially in this country for the past 15 years, we've had austerity. We've really neglected those people. There's been pay freezes, right? There's been underfunding. We've had collapsed roofs of schools and hospitals. And what I would like to see is us recognizing that fact. Now, I'm not saying, liquidate all the investment banks and get rid of them. What I am saying is that if you have much higher tax rates, right, that is what you can afford. You can afford an economy that prioritizes the essential workers and that where you have mass public investment, right, which I think also has positive knock-on effects for the rest of the economy. And you'd basically just be reversing what we did for the last 15 years, which I think is a failed experiment.
But how would you deal with the sort of the demographic time bomb then, which is also an issue that, a lot of people look at the welfare state in this country and say, it's too big, not because I want to make a moral judgment about people, but because I there's a problem that there's too few people in work who are over the age of 55, because that's going to be the dominant group. There's probably too few people who are of working age but not working. Now, you might say if we improve public services, they'll get them healthier and then they're able to work. But that doesn't just the ageing population point, which is because do we need to have cut back, even if we could be more generous in the tax system and money would circulate more, you'd still might make the case that the welfare state is too big.
So I think an ageing population is a real challenge for sure. Now you did specify that I didn't have to worry about backbenchers, so I'll say that immigration is one solution to it. Certainly, people who immigrate tend to be younger and they tend to be working, and that is something that can sustain the pensions system. And also,
they might drive down wages, though. That's one argument that they do, and they affect GDP per capita. That's the argument.
It's really strange to me, and it's something that maybe economists haven't communicated effectively enough. I know immigration's a really emotive issue for a lot of people, and I do understand, but that just doesn't seem to be the case. There's so little evidence that immigrants have negative effects on the country that they're immigrating to. That things like wages don't go down. GDP usually goes up, and they usually contribute more to taxes per capita. Yes, for sure. Because look, the reason that you want immigrants is the same reason you want people, right? Like, there's no difference if you want people to be born and you think that a person is somebody who contributes to the economy, right, in their own individual way, right? Each person is a productive economic unit, right? And that's true of immigrants, and that's true of natives. So
the birth rate is not going to improve anytime soon. I mean, one of the phenomena of the post-capitalist or the late capitalist society is the great thing about allowing equality in education for women is women have a greater chance of being equal. But the downside of that seems everywhere you get education of women, you get a lower birth rate.
Yeah.
So that doesn't seem reversible. Even in Scandinavian countries where they're really generous with their welfare payments, when they're generous with their child support payments, the birth rate's still going down. So that seems to be an ineluctable feature of the post-capitalist, late capitalist world, is where you get good education, you get lower birth rate.
Well, people become more individualistic, I think, and maybe more cosmopolitan, and they tend to pursue their own careers, right? And of course, everybody should have the right to better contraceptives. Everybody should have the right to do that. But you're right, there are consequences of it, and not all of them are positive. I mean, you kind of anticipated my point. I would like to see more childcare as well as part of that kind of that package, to see if you can try and nudge up the birth rate a bit so that people can have children, even if they have so that people have the opportunity to have children if they want to, but even if they do, there is this big demographic shift over time, right? And economists know this, because when countries are really poor, you have loads of kids, frankly, because you need them to support you in your old age, and some of them are going to die, right? And now it's like you can rely on your kids surviving past the age of 5, almost definitely. So people have two, which is slightly below the replacement rate, which is like 2.1 or 2.2, right?
Do you think the world of migration is going to become a sort of economic feature in this way? I mean, I was thinking about this. How we have sort of carbon offsetting, where you basically certain countries or certain industries will produce something, and then they'll align with someone who's using less carbon, and they'll offset their carbon, and they'll work out a balance. I just wonder whether the world of immigration is going to be like that, where we'll pay poor countries to take a certain type of migrant, and rich countries will take another type of migrant. And we're already seeing this. Albania's kind of doing it. Rwanda tried to do it. Yes. Where effectively poor countries commodify migration, and it becomes, I don't know if this is the dystopian kind of sci-fi view, or are we kind of 2 steps along that road already, where ultimately the migrant issue, you could say we're living in the age of migration. Climate change is probably going to make it worse in terms of countries becoming less habitable. I just wonder whether there's going to be a sort of trade, not an illicit trade, a kind of international trade, where you say we will take X amount of this type of migrant, and we'll have to offset that by other types of migrant, and they'll have to go to poorer countries, which will have to kind of be paid by richer countries to accept them, which is kind of already happening.
It's quite a harrowing vision. I think it relates to that notion of
the Rwanda thing. It's happened. Italy are looking at, lots of people are looking at that. And we talk a lot about high-skilled versus low-skilled immigration already, right? And we've been doing that for a long time. And
I welcome high-skilled immigration, but it does create this kind of hierarchy, and you're like, well, wait a minute, just because somebody's low-skilled, which, by the way, has a partial mapping onto the essential worker category that I mentioned earlier, because you're talking about people who do these sort of menial jobs that nonetheless
social care is
support us.
considered low-skilled.
Social care, yeah, exactly.
We
Looking
all need
after a
dying person is considered low-skilled, which is kind of insane if you pause to think about it.
No, we all need care, right? And somebody has to do it at various points in our lives, throughout our lives, when we're very young, when we're very old, but also just every day we need care, right? So somebody has to do that work, and if it's sort of low-skilled immigrants, then that's fine by me. But I do think we've already got that exact distinction that you're talking about. We've got the notion of high-skilled and low-skilled. Whether that develops into something that's a little bit more disturbing, I don't know.
It's not impossible, I don't think. You mentioned housing.
Yes.
I'm interested in that. So in Britain, probably more so than other countries, a house is an asset as well as a place where you live. And therefore, the people with the greatest power in the community, the older people, have an asset they don't want to lose, and they don't want it to depreciate in value. So the political imperative is for always to have housing go up in value. And in fact, the government often cites increase in housing value as a sign of prosperity.
Yeah.
In your radical world if you're Chancellor, if you just halved the price of housing in this country, there'll be, what's interesting, a statistic I didn't realise for a long time, is that there are more people who own a house outright in this country than have a mortgage. So there are people with no danger of negative equity because they own the house outright completely. It's incredibly, amazingly so. So I guess the question is there a world in which halving the housing price, it would be so political, it was never going to happen, but would that be fair? Would that do so? If you did that, would you damage the economy because somehow our economy is intricately linked with our housing market, or would it solve a problem in the economy, in your view?
So I think you would. There's two sides to it, right? Obviously, I think it would be really nice for people like me, my generation and my income bracket, for house prices to halve, and then I might actually be able to think about the possibility of buying one. But there's knock-on effects of that. I do think there would be a lot of effects of people being in negative equity, right? And there would be effects on debt, and that would have knock-on effects on the financial system as well, if people kind of weren't able to pay. And also there's this notion of housing as a pension as well, right?
Yeah.
I think,
but is that right?
It's not right. I don't think it's. So we've replaced our social insurance, our social state with this, right? And I think this is one of Thatcher's genius moves, that just completely privatized. We still have state pensions, but it kind of privatized the pension system in a subtle way, because now that's just that's most people's assets, right? And most people's only asset, in fact. And so you have an entire generation or two who have just completely bought into it. So I do think it's an extremely difficult problem that you raised. Whether would we like to see? I would like to see house prices halved in an ideal world. I think that would be great if we had. I can't see anything wrong in principle with the idea that house prices are not going up or they're falling, right, year to year. You can imagine, politicians celebrating. They're like, oh, house prices are falling. It's like, great, people can buy some, but that's unfortunately just not the world we're in.
It really isn't. And maybe you can't do it painless, but I look back to my parents' generation where they bought a house in 1975, say, and my dad didn't earn a vast amount of money, but he probably bought a house 3 times his salary, and that house was a 3-bedroom house from the Midlands, relatively nondescript but perfectly nice. 3-bedroom house in the Midlands, was affordable, 3 times his salary, and he paid off that mortgage in 20 years later. That was how housing used to work. It was 3 times your salary, 20 years, you paid your mortgage off. Now, that house would be worth 10 times the salary. And you need a huge deposit to get on the ladder. And it might become an appreciable asset. It will work better if you get to own it. But how do you enable anyone to own it? And we talk about the problem of the housing crisis. They'll say, we'll build more houses. But if you build more houses, to the logical conclusion, that will bring house prices down. And no one wants house prices to come down in this country. So it never gets fixed, this, does it?
No. I think one way of getting around it is just to provide social housing directly to people who need it, and that's something that I'm a big advocate of. Now, I think what you end up there is a kind of two-track market, right? And unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma around social housing. There didn't used to be as much, so it doesn't really massively solve the problem. But in terms of getting houses to people who need them, that's what I would do more more radically, to put on my, I guess, more socialist hat. I think we need to think about different forms of ownership for housing. I think we need to think about housing co-ops and communities taking control of land and things like that. You've got these organizations which have grown up around the world. They're usually local government led. They're more communal, and they basically say, no, look, we're going to take control of the housing, and it's run in the interest of the community, in the interest of the members, and we make it available to people who can afford it.
Yeah.
And it's not financialized in the same way.
How close to communism is the notion of that?
I think it's communal. It's very different to centrally planned Soviet communism, but it's I think it's the idea of communism as having communities manage the things that matter to them is actually something that I think almost everybody can get on board with, and being connected to your local community, having a say, having the essential services available to you when you need a house. You go to the housing cooperative or whatever. So I think that's something that is a kind of positive vision of communism and is happening. It's not some sort of magical land that might have been envisioned by 19th century communists. It's just like something that's very practical. It's happening in Preston, for instance, with the Preston model. They've pursued that, and it seems to work.
What do you make of the Trump approach to economics, which is cut taxes to stimulate the economy, impose tariffs for reasons which aren't entirely clear, because some of them are political, some of them are sort of emotional, some of them are economic because they want to try and move, which seems to be working slightly, move pharmaceutical companies back to America. But that world of both low taxes, high debt, high tariffs, that seems to be the Trump approach. What do you make of that as a way of looking at the economics of the world?
Yeah, I don't think that the tariffs are, even from a purely revenue perspective, I don't think they're going to raise enough to sort of pay for modern government spending. I think when it was only tariffs that really raised revenue, you were looking at government spending at like 3% of GDP, a couple of 100 years ago or something like that. It would be like 40, I think, right? So it's just, I don't think it works as a revenue raising mechanism. The tax cuts, I think, they've been cutting taxes on the rich in America for quite a while. I don't think it has produced this kind of investment spree. Some of the studies I mentioned earlier on trickle-down economics are actually about the Bush tax cuts, which were similar. There weren't really any great beneficial effects, and it made the rich richer. I think you're looking at something very similar. And as for the tariffs policy, I mean, in itself, where do you start? It's just absolute chaos, and I think it's creating a lot of uncertainty. One of the things that bothers me really is that Trump did inherit an economy that was growing quite fast, and also Trump's philosophy is America first, right? And bringing things back to America. I understand some of that. I think, the negative effects of globalization, the left behind communities, the supply chain crisis as well. I think we've seen that we can't rely on global trade for everything, and there are negative consequences.
Pharmaceuticals is quite a good example where they feel they don't make enough of their own antibiotics and stuff like that.
Completely understand that, but a lot of Biden's policies, they were creating growth in a lot of these industries, and they were bringing manufacturing jobs back to America, and he's reversed these and then put tariffs on, which just seem to have caused much more harm than good, because Biden already had tariffs, right? Let's not forget that he had tariffs, but they were targeted. It was like these key industries, and they were mostly they were much larger on China, but he also had subsidies for these factories that they were trying to build, and that was working, I think, in a lot of ways. And I don't know why, except for politics and incompetence, Trump would reverse that, because I think the aims that he wants to achieve, or he says that he wants to achieve, they were kind of being achieved better by those policies.
To come back to your book, just to finish, why we're getting poorer, is some of it our fault as the punters and the voters? Because we kind of want to live in a world where we have low taxes and high public services.
Yeah.
And we want... And actually increasingly so, which is why I wonder whether the world has become more left-wing economically, which is that it does expect the government to do more. I think COVID really established just how much people want the government to do.
Yeah.
We never want the government to do less, and yet we want to pay less tax. So are we unrealistic? Have we been encouraged to believe in a world where you don't have to pay taxes, but you also get really good public services? Or is your answer to that tax billionaires more, and then we would have both?
No. My unpopular opinion is that we need higher taxes on the middle class. Actually, I think if you look at the Scandinavian welfare states and the Northern European welfare states, they do tend to have higher taxes. I understand that people are struggling. I'm not talking about jacking up your tax rate by 10% overnight, right? And you just have to remember that you do get something back.
Yeah.
You know, we've seen huge declines in public services in this country, and people notice it. You get that back, right? And, you know, you do lose some of the money that you can spend on Amazon or Deliveroo or whatever, but I think for it, you get a much better society.
So is that sort of a 60%, 60% marginal tax rate for people earning 100 grand, that sort of thing?
That sounds like it's in the ballpark. That's about 60% people earning 100 grand, and you know, even increases for people at 50 grand. And people don't like that, but you know, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of economy do we want to live in?
And the answer to that is we probably want the best of everything. And but how do you achieve this? Because you write this book, and you are an economist, and you teach people, and you make a persuasive case for people to listen to. But political reality seems to be political reality, and politics is a very hard thing. Then it's a question of politics, isn't it? Like what do you want, and what you're willing to pay for? And I'm not sure an economist you can't influence politics, or maybe you can.
I mean, look, I've been for a long time. I've been part of this organisation called Rethinking Economics, and there was this whole student movement to change economics education, and we were very dissatisfied with the way we were taught economics. It was very abstract. It was very detached. It seemed kind of too market friendly. It didn't engage with the kind of issues that I engage with in the book, and you know, that. It was and is a movement focused on universities and education. But I think over time it's become part of a much bigger intellectual shift in how we view economics. And you have things like modern monetary theory, right, for instance, which became very popular and was very influential in the Biden administration. And I think that was born of this big movement. So I do think that by changing the ideas and campaigning for things which maybe don't seem directly political, economics education at university, they don't seem like they're to do with government, I do think you can create a movement that goes on to have bigger impacts.
I guess the problem is you need faith in the system. So if someone's going to take more money from me for taxes, I'd have to believe that they'd spend it properly. And I wonder if that's the final step that you can't take anyone, because I wouldn't trust certainly I wouldn't trust politicians in this country. I think I was American, I wouldn't trust politicians in America.
Yeah.
I don't know about Scandinavian countries, but we see colossal wastage in government. We see colossal projects fail, with HS2 being an example. We don't really believe in it. You know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in this country said we're 113 billion in infrastructure.
Yeah.
But you've got to believe that it'll be spent, and it'll be spent properly, and it'll get a return. And it's the faith point I keep coming back to. Do we have faith that if we did spend more money in taxation and we did tax people more, the political classes would spend the money properly?
Over time, I've become more and more of a fan of devolution, actually, and it goes back to what I was saying about community wealth building, because I think if you take, you're right, absolutely right, national politicians, you know, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer, nobody's really has faith in these people. Nobody's inspired by them. In the US, even worse, right? But if you look at local politicians, someone like Andy Burnham, who's actually done really well and transformed Manchester, I think that there is much more hope there. And so I would like to see more powers given to local governments, more taxation powers and things like that. And I think that's where people can have more direct input and can trust politicians a bit better, and they can see the results much more clearly.
And before you go, you've had some bold policies, because you don't have to worry about your backbenchers. Is there one other unpopular or bold policy that you would like to think that or articulate that would make a difference, do you think? One other thing.
One other thing. I would like to see central banks fund a universal basic income.
So you're pro that?
Everyone has an account with the central bank. You get maybe, let's say, $1,000 a month in it. It's directly financed. Instead of being funneled through the financial sector, it's a quantitative easing for the people. That's a baseline. You can't fall below that level of poverty. Everybody gets it. It's your right as a citizen.
And in a world of AI, when people's jobs start drifting...
Absolutely.
But who pays for it?
Central bank. They can finance it directly.
They could afford it?
They can afford it, yeah.
How do they afford it if they give everyone $12,000 a year? How does that work?
Well, the central bank can create money, right? So you're talking about them literally creating money.
So you're genuinely creating 12 new grand a year.
It'd be a different vision of monetary policy, and it's something that I would really like to see, and I think we can afford. I think our economy has the capacity for it, and there's lots of experiments done on UBI, and it just has almost solely beneficial effects without any negative effects like inflation and things like that.
There we go. Well, listen, we've done a lot in that half hour.
We have, yeah. We have. Wow.
It's a really interesting book, and it's really important to talk about this stuff. You talk about economic education, actually talking about this stuff, whatever you agree with or disagree with, having the conversation is so important. The book is called Why We're Getting Poorer. Dr Cahal Moran wrote it, and also has joined us for the last half hour. Really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. And do comment beneath the line. You'll be respectful and thoughtful, I know. And stick around with us on Thinkers. We'll do this more again. Hit follow, hit subscribe, and we'll be back with some more big ideas very soon. Thank you so much for joining us.